how the people are doing. So, this comparison, look, I get it. I know I've been promising this one for a while. I did finally deliver, but it's a little late, mainly because I wanted to finish off the review. And once I was basically going on with the review, the OnePlus 13 decided to show up. And, well, I had to get samples for that. And look, that comparison, the one with the OnePlus 13, it's gonna be balls to the walls crazy. I'm more than certain that everybody's excited about it, as am I. But we'll get to that right after this video. But anyways, talking about these two flagships, look, the primary point of concern with the Vivo X200 Pro is that it just has a downgraded sensor with the main camera, which should be an international crime at this point at least. But well, it's not really the case yet. We'll see how things go. Now, the concern here is this. There are definitely certain areas where we will see problems with regards to the main sensor being downgraded. Now, how much of that is actually a problem with the sensor, the hardware itself, and how much of that is an optimization issue, I'm not entirely certain because I do have some doubts. I'll talk more about it as we get into it, but yeah, let's break it down. Let's see exactly how both of these fare, because I think it's going to be a much closer comparison, despite the fact that these are technically an entire generation apart. Well, half a generation to be precise. Alright, so if you know anything about Vivo smartphones and mostly their flagships, well then you would know all about the color profiles that they have. You have the vivid colors, we have the texture mode, which is a stunning profile but very situational because it can sometimes completely and entirely crush your shadows. But then we also have Zeiss's natural colors, which is arguably one of the absolute best color profiles that I've ever used. But before we talk about anything else, let's just crop into 500% with the main camera in good, almost sunset-esque lighting conditions where, you know, it's not ideal, but it's not particularly bad either. This is a very common condition that people like to shoot photos in, so cropping in, as you can probably tell, it's a subtle difference, most definitely. But yes, the X100 Ultra, if you notice the lines, I'm not sure how much you can see on YouTube, but if you notice the lines, it looks a little bit better represented, a little bit more refined on the X100 Ultra as opposed to the X200 Pro, which, well, I could argue on one hand that, yeah, it's a very minor difference. You're looking at this with a 500% crop on a 12 megapixel shot. No one's ever going to do that, so it's not going to affect you in a realistic sense. But on the other hand, the X200 Pro is supposed to be the successor to the X100 Ultra and the X100 series in general. There should never be a downgrade. That we should not even be debating this here. Now, even though we get Zeiss's natural colors on both, there are still subtle differences in the way things are processed, because the X200 Pro, it has lower exposure and higher contrast, which is very good. It's almost perfect most of the time. I think the balancing on the X200 Pro, it is refined to near perfection. That's definitely a good thing on the X200 Pro, and the X100 Ultra, as you can probably tell, it's not really quite as good. Even in kind of high contrast situations like sunset time, it still looks far better on the X100 Pro in the way things are just balanced out. However, arguably one of the biggest problems on the X100 Ultra, as you can probably tell at this point, dynamic range. It has been entirely fixed on the Vivo X200 Pro. Now, in my personal opinion, I would argue that thus far, as you have probably seen, the X200 Pro, with its hardware downgrade, it ended up having slightly less detail preservation as opposed to the X100 Ultra. But if you were to ask me, I would pick the X200 Pro for a regular main camera photography any day, simply because I can take good, beautiful sunset shots like these, and those require proper good dynamic range, and that's not something the X100 Ultra provides. With the ultrawide cameras, now don't quote me on this because I'm not entirely certain, but I think the ultrawide sensors are the same or very similar, and there's not really much difference, at least in the practical sense. There's not much difference when it comes to the photography here. Although I must admit, I do kind of like how the X100 Ultra is processing the images. It does tend to provide a lot more contrast with the ultrawide camera as opposed to the main camera, because now, as you can tell, is basically just as good with contrast and exposure as the X200 Pro. That's obviously a good thing, and sometimes it can go even crazy. It can go for even more contrast and it looks really nice. At least in my personal opinion, I love high contrast, and the X100 Ultra's ultra-wide camera can really provide that. And then the dynamic range. Look, to this date, I've not yet figured out exactly what the problem is with the X100 Ultra, but for some reason, it can give us very good dynamic range with the ultra-wide camera, but it cannot do that with the main camera, which is arguably a much more important camera on the rear. So why is the dynamic range so much worse with the main camera on the X100 Ultra? I'll never know. But what I can tell you is that the X200 Pro and the X100 Ultra, both of them will provide really good dynamic range with the ultrawide at the very least. Now, when it comes to the telephoto macro photography, you might think it's very similar because after all, we have very similar sensors with the 3.7x telephoto. But there is a subtle difference. The X200 Pro allegedly has a newer sensor, but it also seems like the macro capabilities have gone downhill. Now look, I'm not exactly thrilled about the fact that we're getting these small downgrades, because even though it's a subtle and a small difference, the X100 Ultra is the one that can get closer. And when it comes to macro photography, the closer you can get, even if it's like a millimeter closer, it's still going to be a much better shot, and that's exactly how it looks. And the same can be said for the 2x sensor crop that is slapped on top of the 3.7x telephoto macro that we have. It works really well on both. The X200 Pro in the 2025 generation of smartphones might just be the best for macro photography, but compared to the Vivo X100 Ultra, it doesn't get as close to the subject. And now for the thing that I've been waiting to test out, 2x sensor crop. So I'm expecting the X100 Ultra to just pull ahead here because it had better detail in the regular main camera shot that we saw. So the 2x sensor crop, which does rely quite heavily on the sheer quality of the main sensor that you have, well, the X100 Ultra does seem to have an advantage, doesn't it? And well, that's exactly what's going on here. The X200 Pro has significantly lower detail. I mean, that's supposed to happen, right? Like, we cropped into 500% in the previous one, and effectively in this case, we're cropping into 1000% from a main camera shot. Obviously, I'm sure that it has a little bit more optimization given that we are using 2x sensor crop, but at the end of the day, the sensor quality is going to significantly affect the quality of the shot that you're gonna get with 2x sensor crop at the very least. Now the 3.7x, this I'm hoping is gonna be very similar across the board, because far as I know, the sensor quality between the telephoto cameras between these two smartphones, it's very similar. Now it might appear as if the X200 Pro has more detail, but I think most of it is just higher contrast, slightly more clarity, and maybe a little bit more sharpening going on as well. So not really a big difference. Now this right here is a 10x shot, and the X200 Pro does seem to have a bit of a problem with AI processing being a little too much. Things going a little too overboard with that. So let's see how the X100 Ultra fares. Now cropping in, you can obviously tell that there's a lot of processing happening on both. I don't think it's particularly higher on the X200 Pro as opposed to the X100 Ultra. Maybe a little bit of sharpening is being added, a little bit of extra sharpening, I should say, that is being added on the X200 Pro, but it's not a massive difference to say the least. However, with the main camera high res, I'm gonna venture a guess and say that the X200 Pro, because it had less detail with the main camera shots, significantly less detail with the 2x sensor crop, I'd say the X100 Ultra, in this case at least, is definitely gonna pull ahead, because the high res, it's all about detail preservation, isn't it? And guess what? That is exactly the case. It's a serious difference that we're seeing here, because the X100 Ultra, every single line looks so much better, so much nicer, so much more defined, naturally detailed, as opposed to the X200 Pro, which has a lot of sharpening, a lot of processing, but still somehow less detail as opposed to the X100 Ultra. So it's a serious problem. And then of course the ultra-wide camera. Now once again, I'm not expecting a ton of difference here because they have been performing fairly similarly, but I am noticing that we do get slightly wider field of view on the Vivo X100 Ultra. Well, cropping all the way in to 500%. As you can probably tell, it's not really that big a difference. Yes, the X200 Pro does seem to have a little bit more sharpening action happening, while the X100 Ultra, it actually has some of the details, especially in the shadows, being exemplified because it has high contrast. So, as I said, not exactly a big difference. But then the 3.7x. Now here once again, I'm not expecting a massive difference, but we'll see. So, first and foremost, we have the 50 megapixel mode. Now bear in mind, this is a bin down version because the technical resolution on both is 200 megapixels. We'll get to that. But of course, as you can probably tell, these are some of the highest quality telephoto cameras that we have, and at 50 megapixels, I feel like there's a little bit more detail on the X100 Ultra, which once again, just why does the X200 Pro, the successor, not have more detail as opposed to the X100 Ultra? It should not be the other way around. Really shouldn't. Even a small minor difference like this should not exist. But of course, if you're gonna use high res, you might as well use 200 megapixels, because with both of these phones, we have had some really good results with the 200 megapixel mode. And by that in mind, let's crop in, and let's just say that this is This is a genuine difference. Like, yeah, 50 megapixels, a minor difference, especially with the 500% crop and so on and so forth. But 200 megapixels, the X100 Ultra is just blatantly better. It appears as if I'm using just the 50 megapixel mode on the X200 Pro. I'm not. I checked. But this is kind of disappointing now, because I had genuinely thought that the problems were limited to the main camera, but it appears as if it's a much more broader processing problem that we have, because I don't believe the sensor with the 3.7x that we have here is actually lower quality. Rather, I think the processing is just not able to take advantage in the same manner that the X100 Ultra does. Now, when it comes to selfies overall, it's actually pretty good on the X200 Pro. I did have this one particular comparison, the very first comparison I made with the X200 Pro against the Oppo Find X8 Pro. I basically got some of the most atrocious and horrible selfies that I've ever seen. I thought that was one of the biggest problems on the X200 Pro, but seemingly it has been fixed. Now, I have also heard a lot of people say that the selfies just don't look good on the X200 Pro. I don't really feel that way, because at least compared to the X100 Ultra, we have higher contrast, we have slightly better skin tones, because a lot of times you can notice that the X100 Ultra makes my skin look very yellowish, which is not the case obviously. So yeah, it generally turns out really good, and even the dynamic range is quite nice. I especially like the higher contrast on the X100 Pro, as you would have guessed. And well, obviously the same can be said for portrait selfies as well. It's basically the same across the board, and it's just slightly better in my personal opinion as opposed to the X100 Ultra. Now, speaking of course, rear camera portraits, so I think it's actually pretty phenomenal on both. To be entirely honest, I don't have any problems with either of these. I do think that in general the X200 Pro gives you slightly higher contrast, but in this particular dynamic range test, it kind of failed miserably, which is sad to say the least. But of course, for regular portraits, for every single focal length that we have, the 35, 50mm, 85mm and so on, it turns out pretty much phenomenal on both. The X100 Ultra does tend to give you slightly less saturation, which I think a lot of people will prefer, but the higher contrast on the X100 Pro, that's what really draws me towards that. However, the 135mm portrait, see, this was taken in very challenging lighting, not exactly a ton of light, but it is also fairly backlit. Now, in this case, I don't think the X200 is doing a good job with the backlit situation, but the detail preservation is atrocious. Trust me, we took multiple shots, we always do, and this was the consistent result that we got on the X200 Pro. It's obviously just not capable of handling the situation, not nearly as well as the X100 Ultra, and once again, it should be the other way around. And then lastly, we have the night portraits. Now, overall, it looks very similar. I kind of like the skin tones on the X100 Ultra this time around as opposed to the X200 Pro, but take a look at the highlights at the bottom of the shot. They are fairly blown out on the X100 Ultra. Definitely didn't handle that part quite as well as the X200 Pro. So there are subtle differences between the two, to say the least. And that obviously brings us over to the rear camera night mode. So here's the deal. I like the X200 Pro significantly more as opposed to the X100 Ultra for a very simple and obvious reason. If you know anything about my preferences when it comes to night mode shots and so on and so forth, you know exactly why I like the X200 Pro so much. Vivo finally decided to fix the night mode situation. Fix it as in just tune it to the point that you can actually get shots that look like they were taken at night, as opposed to the atrociously brightened and weirdly blue skies that you get on the X100 Ultra. It looks so unnatural, and it's one of the biggest pet peeves that I've ever had with Vivo flagships. It's not just the X100 Ultra. Basically every single Vivo flagship that we have had in a very long time, all of them have had this problem with just over brightening night mode shots and making them look very artificial. Not the case anymore with the X200 Pro, which, as you can probably tell, I couldn't be happy about it. Now, of course, we have to take a look at the details, right? So this is ultra low light. By ultra low light, I mean both of these phones, even the X100 Ultra, which has a 1-inch sensor much larger than the X200 Pro, even that phone required a full 5 seconds of exposure, if I'm remembering it right. So yeah, I basically couldn't see jack shit, and so it's a difficult situation, unrealistic, but it will tell us exactly how well these sensors can gather light. And just as you would have expected, in a situation like this, yes, the X100 Ultra is going to pull ahead here. Hardware advantage is going to be key, and well, that's exactly where the X100 Ultra is doing a better job, which again, I think this is the third time I'm saying it, should have been the other way around. But here's another thing that I want to point out. That test right there, the ultra low light, I don't know how realistic it is. I don't feel like most people are gonna take ultra low light shots for no reason, right? What's more important is the fact that we get really good and realistic night mode on the X200 Pro. And under normal night mode conditions where you do have some degree of light, well, then the X200 Pro is going to perform almost just as good as the X100 Ultra, as you can probably tell with this 500% crop. It's very close on both, no question about it. The only difference that I can tell after a lot of pixel peeping is that the X100 Ultra has maybe a little bit more sharpening. And now then, the ultra-wide camera. So, as you would have guessed, the quality is very good on both. But, man, the blue night skies on the X100 Ultra, they get out of hand. Let me tell you right now. Like, the main camera, it was bad enough, but with the ultra-wide camera as well, like you really just don't capture the essence of night. That's the best way to put it. It just doesn't have the same look and feel as you would hope when it comes to a night mode shot. Is the technical quality good on the X100 Ultra? Well, of course it is, but the fact that you get these slightly over brightened and almost washed out images as opposed to the X200 Pro, which maintains that nighttime look, that exposure, that contrast, the dark night skies, once again, well, it's there's really no proper argument for me, at least, or from my end, for the X100 Ultra here. Now, of course, 2x sensor crop at night, so I'd say that we can all guess that the X100 Ultra in this case is gonna pull ahead. Like, it pulled ahead at daytime, so naturally it should pull ahead at night as well, right? But that's not exactly what's happening here, because I did take multiple shots. I always take multiple shots. Maybe it has something to do with the subject, but whatever the case, it does appear that the X200 Pro is quite a bit better as opposed to the X100 Ultra. Like, it's definitively better as opposed to the X100 Ultra here. Once again, I honestly have no idea why. But then, the 3.7x. So I forgot to take this one outdoors, so we took this indoors. And indoors, as you can probably tell, it was obscenely dark when I took this shot. Basically ultra low light, almost ultra low light here. But we got to crop in all the way, and so here's the deal. I think the X100 Ultra is maybe going a little overboard with the noise reduction. So it's just a little too smoothened out, and a lot of the details are just being mushed together. While the X200 Pro, I would say, is doing a slightly better job. It does have more grain. Overall, I think it's doing a slightly better job as opposed to the X100 Ultra, just in terms of the way it's being processed. And then just for the fun of it, this is, I believe, a 10x shot of this ridiculous sculpture, which basically looks like trash bags piled up on top of each other somehow. I don't know who decided to go for this, but wow, it does make a really good subject for cropping into 500% and checking out details. Well, at 10x, once again, very similar across the board. I mean, this was in regular nighttime lighting, with street lights and so on and so forth. It wasn't exactly ultra low light like the previous shot. So, with all of that said, I think here's my theory about this. It is probably a 50-50 or maybe a 60-40 split between the hardware being a downgrade and the software not being optimized. 60% the hardware, obviously, because the main camera, that is it's just sad, simply. And the 3.7x, the issues that we noticed with the 3.7x, especially with the 200 megapixel mode not being all that good as opposed to the X100 Ultra, I think that has a lot to do with the software processing just not being properly optimized and just not being refined enough to handle the situations, to handle the resolution, and really bring out all the details that you really want at the end of the day. That's the whole point, right? But here's the thing. Overall, when you're taking regular shots, I would actually go so far as to say that the X200 Pro is gonna fare better, mainly because, in my opinion, it has much better contrast. It has much more natural, very realistic looking photographs that you can have, even with essential colors turned on both of them. The X200 Pro produces much nicer looking shots. Once again, this is a personal opinion. And secondly, the dynamic range on the main camera is so much better on the X200 Pro that, as opposed to the slightly lower detail preservation, it just makes a lot more sense, right? Now yes, the 2x sensor crop, the high-res situation with both the main and the 3.7x telephoto, it's very sad and it's just unfortunate on the X200 Pro. Really, it should not be less as opposed to its direct predecessor. Well, maybe not direct, but well, it is a predecessor nonetheless. But look, it's just, I really hope that Vivo refines the software. I don't know if you're gonna get a hardware upgrade with the X200 Ultra, but I will be hoping for it. And it's about time. Vivo, they really need to launch the Ultra series globally. With that said, I'll be seeing you soon enough with the OnePlus 13's comparison with the X200 Pro. Cheers.